Welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. The mirror reflected a bride in blush and lace, and it wasn't the one I expected. I have been thinking about how to tell this story for a long time. Longer than I probably should have. There is something about the events of that particular night, the night before my wedding, that has resisted every simple version I have tried to give it. I tried once to summarize it over dinner with a close friend, someone who I thought would understand, and I watched his expression move through polite confusion into something closer to amusement, and I stopped talking midway through. Not because I was embarrassed, exactly, but because I realized I was still not ready. The story was not finished yet. Not inside me. And a story that is not finished inside you cannot be told cleanly to someone else. What comes out is fragments. What comes out is noise. You see people trying to arrange their faces into expressions that feel appropriate, and you watch them search for the right response, and you understand that you have not given them enough, that you have given them the outline without the substance, the shape without the weight. So I stopped. I sat with it for another year. Then another. And then I reached a point, not long ago, where I felt it settle. Where it became something I could hold without it trembling in my hands. And that, I think, is the right time to tell a story. Not when it is still raw and unresolved, not when you are still inside it searching for the exit, but when you have found the exit and walked through it, and you are standing on the other side looking back, and you understand, at least partially, what the whole thing was actually about. So let me start from the beginning. Not from the night before the wedding. That night is important, it is, in many ways, the center of this entire story, but the night before the wedding did not happen in isolation. Nothing important ever does. What happened that night only made the kind of sense that it eventually made to me because of everything that had come before it. A lifetime of small confusions. A lifetime of quietly filed away questions. A lifetime of performing a version of myself that was mostly accurate, mostly comfortable, but never quite complete. And I think that is the real story. The real story is not about a wedding night ritual, though we will get there. The real story is about a person, about me, and the long and largely invisible journey of trying to understand who that person actually was. I grew up in a household that was, by most standard measurements, ordinary. My father worked long hours in a management role for a manufacturing company. My mother was a secondary school teacher who came home carrying the particular exhaustion that belongs to people who spend their days managing the emotional lives of teenagers. I have one older brother, Daniel, who was and remains the kind of person who moves through the world with an ease that I quietly envied for most of my childhood. He was athletic without being arrogant. He was socially fluent in ways I never felt myself to be. He knew, without being taught, how to walk into a room and belong there. I watched him do it from a very young age, and I stored the observation somewhere in my memory like a reference document, something to return to when I needed instructions on how to be a person. Because I did need instructions, or at least I felt that I did. I felt, from a fairly early age, that there was something in me that did not come with its own clear operating guide. Something that required more attention, more deliberate management, more conscious navigation than it seemed to require in other people. I want to be careful here about how I describe this, because it is easy to dramatize it in retrospect, to paint the childhood version of yourself as more isolated or more confused than you actually were. The truth is that my childhood was not unhappy. I had friends. I did well in school, particularly in subjects like history and literature, which my father regarded with polite skepticism and my mother regarded with genuine pride. I played football for a local team until I was about 14, at which point I quietly retired from it because the social dynamics of team sports had become more stressful to me than the playing itself. I was not bullied in any serious or sustained way. I was not an outcast. I was what people tend to describe when they look back at someone like me as a child, quiet, thoughtful, a little bit unusual in a way that nobody could quite name, but that registered as a faint background hum in the way adults spoke to me or about me. There was often a quality of mild puzzlement in the eyes of people who were trying to categorize me. I could feel it. Children are extraordinarily sensitive to the ways that adults fail to categorize them. The first moment I can identify clearly, the first moment where something snagged on something inside me and left a mark that I could still feel years later, happened when I was about 7 years old. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of ordinary household moment that could easily have passed unnoticed and been forgotten, except that it did not pass unnoticed and was not forgotten. My mother was getting ready for a formal dinner, a colleague's retirement event or something similar, and she was at her dressing table applying makeup with the practiced efficiency of someone who has performed this ritual thousands of times. I was sitting on the edge of the bed behind her, ostensibly doing homework but actually watching her in the mirror. I was watching the whole process, the deliberate strokes of foundation across her cheeks, the careful attention around her eyes, the way she held her expression very still and neutral while she worked, as if the face were a canvas that required her full concentration. And I remember feeling something that I could not, at 7 years old, have given any articulate name to. It was not envy exactly. It was not desire in any sense that I understood. It was something closer to recognition. A sense of being present at something that mattered, something that was weighted with meaning that I could not yet decode, and feeling, in some complicated and inarticulate way, that the weight of it was somehow mine to carry too. She caught me watching in the mirror, and she smiled, and she said, "Do you want to see?" I nodded. She held up a small compact mirror and showed me the difference between one side of her face and the other, the finished side, and the plain side. She was not making any point. She was not teaching me anything consciously. She was just sharing a small moment with her child. But I absorbed something from it that went beyond the surface of the moment. I absorbed the understanding that the face you showed to the world required effort, required care, required the kind of deliberate construction that happened behind the scenes before anyone else was watching. And I absorbed something else too, something quieter, the understanding that I found this construction interesting in a way that I sensed, even then, I was probably not supposed to find interesting. Not because it was forbidden. Nobody had told me it was forbidden. But because I was aware of a faint discrepancy between what I felt and what I imagined I was expected to feel. And faint discrepancies, when you are 7 years old and already in the business of careful internal monitoring, are enough to begin the long work of compartmentalization. I kept that compartment for a very long time. Throughout my childhood and into my adolescence, I was aware of a category of interest that I did not express, a range of curiosity that I did not explore, a set of questions that I asked myself only in the privacy of my own mind and then filed carefully away before they could surface where anyone might see them. They were not questions about my sexuality. I want to be precise about this, because I think conflating these categories has caused a great deal of confusion in public discourse about identity, and it has certainly caused a great deal of confusion in the private lives of people who, like me, found themselves sitting with questions that did not fit neatly into the available frameworks. My questions were not, fundamentally, about who I was attracted to. My questions were about the performance of gender itself. About the codes and rituals and materials and behaviors that society had sorted into two distinct columns and labeled, with great confidence, masculine and feminine. I was fascinated by the feminine column in a way that the available cultural scripts I had access to did not account for. I was fascinated by it intellectually, aesthetically, empathetically. I was interested in understanding it from the inside, the way you are interested in understanding a language you have not been taught, but whose music you can hear through the walls of a building you have been told you cannot enter. I did not act on this curiosity for years. And by act on it I mean something very modest. I mean I did not let it surface in any observable way, did not allow it to break through into the space of my daily performed life. I dressed as expected. I carried myself as expected. I learned, through observation and iteration, the specific vocabulary of masculinity that my particular social environment required, and I deployed it with reasonable competence. I was not performing a lie, exactly. There was genuine truth in how I presented. But there was also genuine omission. A whole floor of the building that I kept locked and to which I alone held the key, and into which I descended occasionally, alone, to sit with the questions that lived there, and then ascended again, locking the door carefully behind me. By the time I was in my early 20s, I had developed a reasonably comfortable relationship with this locked floor. I had come to understand it not as a problem requiring a solution but as a feature of my interior landscape that I had simply not yet found a way to integrate into the rest of myself. I had a small number of very close friends, people I trusted, but even with them the door remained locked. Not because I feared their judgment, precisely, but because I had spent so many years keeping the question private that the habit of privacy had become structural. It was not a decision I remade each time. It was simply the default setting. I met Elena when I was 26 years old. I will not linger too long on the early details of our relationship, not because they are unimportant, but because this is not primarily a love story in the conventional sense, and I do not want to reduce what we had and have to the kind of romantic shorthand that strips out all the texture. What I will say is this: Elena was the first person in my adult life who seemed to perceive, with very little effort, the floor I kept locked. She did not name it. She did not press on it. She simply moved through her relationship with me in a way that suggested she was aware of its existence and had decided, with great generosity and patience, to wait. She waited the way a person waits who is confident that eventually the door will open, not because they intend to force it, but because they trust the person on the other side. That quality of patient trust is the most intimate thing I have ever experienced. It asked more of me than any direct question could have. Elena came from a family that I found, in the early months of our relationship, simultaneously compelling and slightly bewildering. Her mother, Margaret, was a woman of tremendous warmth and absolute precision in equal measure. Her father, Roland, was a former academic who had transitioned into consulting work and who possessed the particular quality of people who have spent decades listening to students. He had a way of making you feel that whatever you said next would be received with genuine interest, which had the paradoxical effect of making you very careful about what you chose to say. Elena had one older sister, Caroline, who was brisk and funny and direct in a way that I found refreshing, and one younger brother, Thomas, who was 20 when I met him and who was navigating his own particular version of early adulthood with a combination of enthusiasm and mild chaos that Elena regarded with fond exasperation. It was a family shaped by conversation. They talked at dinner the way some families watch television, with genuine investment, with interruption, with laughter and occasional disagreement. They talked about feelings with a directness that my own family had never quite managed, not from any deficiency of love, but simply because the emotional vocabulary of my childhood home had been a more abbreviated one. In Elena's family, it was normal to say, "I felt dismissed when that happened," or, "I think I responded the way I did because I was afraid," or, "I need us to talk about this because it has been sitting in me and I do not know how to resolve it alone." I found this both nourishing and initially quite terrifying. The terrifying part came from the recognition that I had never been required to be this articulate about my inner life, and that years of not being required to be articulate had perhaps left me less practiced than I should have been. It was during one of those family dinners, perhaps 18 months into my relationship with Elena, that I first heard a reference to what her family called the Eve tradition. Elena's cousin was getting married the following summer, and Margaret was discussing the preparations with a particular energy that suggested she found the organizational aspects of wedding planning genuinely satisfying. And then, in the middle of describing flower arrangements or caterers or some other logistical detail, she said something about the Eve tradition, about how she needed to speak to the cousin's partner before the wedding, and then moved on with the conversation as if she had not just dropped something extraordinary into the middle of the table. I let it pass. But I noted it, the way I noted most things that seemed to carry hidden significance. I filed it away. I did not ask. Not then. I asked Elena about it later that night, in the car on the way home. She was quiet for a moment before she answered, and I recognized the quality of that particular quiet. It was the quiet of someone choosing their words with care, not because they are hiding something but because they are handling something that they want to get exactly right. She told me that the Eve tradition was something her mother had introduced into the family after observing a similar practice described to her by a friend from a different cultural background. She said it had been adapted and evolved within their family over 2 generations. She said the precise form of it varied depending on the couple and the circumstances, but that the underlying intention was consistent. The intention was to ask the partner entering the marriage, usually, in their family's specific history, the groom, to spend the eve of the wedding doing something that no amount of intellectual understanding could substitute for. To spend it, in some meaningful and whole form, experiencing what it actually meant to be a bride. Not the romance of it. Not the joy of it. But the full weight of it. The preparation, the expectation, the physical experience, the emotional reality, and, her word, said carefully, the vulnerability of it. I remember that I did not say anything immediately. I remember the road ahead of us, the ordinary streetlights and the quiet of the late evening, and the way the silence in the car felt different from ordinary silence, felt charged with something that was waiting to see where I would put it. I asked her if she was telling me this because she was telling me this, or if she was telling me this because it was something she intended to happen. She said, with characteristic precision, both. She said she had thought for a long time about whether and how to raise it. She said she understood it was not a small thing to ask. She said she did not want me to feel pressured, but that she also did not want to deprive me of the choice by simply not mentioning it. She said that in her family's experience of the tradition, the value of it had almost always exceeded the expectation of it, for everyone involved. And then she said something that has stayed with me in its exact phrasing. She said, "I think there are things you already understand about this that you have not said out loud yet, and I want to give you the space to decide whether you are ready." I did not respond immediately. We finished the drive home. We went inside. We made tea, both of us, and sat at the kitchen table, and eventually I said, "I need some time to think about this." And she said, "Of course." And we went to bed without resolving it, which was, I realized later, exactly the right way to handle it. She did not push. She did not withdraw. She simply created space and left it there, open, available, mine to enter or not to enter on my own terms. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I thought about it with the methodical intensity that I tend to bring to things that are actually important to me, which means I was very quiet about it externally and very loud about it internally. I thought about all the obvious reasons not to do it. I thought about the discomfort, the vulnerability, the sheer foreignness of the experience as I imagined it. I thought about the potential for awkwardness, for embarrassment, for the kind of exposure that does not feel safe until it feels unavoidable. I thought about what it might mean for how Elena's family perceived me. I thought about what it might mean for how I perceived myself. And then, underneath all of that, underneath all the procedural analysis, I thought about the locked floor. I thought about 20 years of questions that had never been answered, not because they were unanswerable, but because I had never allowed them into the room where answers live. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised me in its simplicity, here is a door being offered, and it is being offered with care, with intention, with the kind of thoughtful framing that makes the crossing of a threshold something other than a leap into darkness. It is being offered as a legitimate passage. And I was 31 years old, and I was about to marry the person I loved more than anyone I had ever known, and the question I had been carrying quietly for 24 years was still there, still unanswered, still gently humming in its locked room. And I thought, if not now, when? And I thought, if not this way, what way? I told Elena I would do it. Her response was quiet and warm and unsurprised in a way that told me she had, in some part of herself, been waiting for exactly this answer. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in early June. The plan, as Elena explained it over the following weeks, was straightforward in its logistics and complicated in everything else. On the Friday evening, the eve, I would arrive at her family home at 6 o'clock. Her mother and her sister and Elena herself would be present. The evening would unfold over several hours. I would be guided through, step by step, as much of the experience of being a bride as it was possible to create. Not as costume. Not as performance for entertainment. But as sincere, honest immersion. I would be asked to engage with it as fully as I was able, not to comment from the outside but to enter it from the inside. At the end of the evening, we would all eat together, and we would talk, and then I would go to my own accommodation for the night and Elena would stay at the house, and the following morning we would marry. I spent the weeks between that conversation and the evening itself in a state that I can only describe as a very specific kind of low-grade alertness. Not anxiety, precisely, though there was anxiety in it. Not excitement, precisely, though there was excitement in it too. Something more like the heightened attentiveness of a person who understands that they are approaching something significant and wants to arrive with full presence, with nothing important left unexamined before the threshold. I was aware of something loosening. Something that had been held in tension for a very long time, some internal posture that had been slightly too rigid for comfort, beginning, almost imperceptibly, to soften. On the Friday evening I drove to Elena's family home in the particular slanted light of early June, when the day is still long enough that dusk feels almost theoretical, and the world has the quality of amber glass, warm and slightly unreal. I parked on the road outside and sat in the car for perhaps 5 minutes before going in. Not from reluctance. More from a desire to be still for a moment before the stillness became unavailable. I was aware of the evening ahead of me as a kind of threshold, and I wanted to stand at it consciously, not to rush past it. Margaret answered the door. She took both my hands in hers and looked at me in the way that she sometimes did, with that quality of perception that I found both disarming and deeply safe. She said, "I am glad you are here." The simplicity of it, the warmth without ceremony, opened something in my chest. I said, "I am glad to be here." And I meant it in a way that already felt more layered than any previous version of that phrase. Caroline was in the living room, sitting on the arm of the sofa in a way that suggested she had probably been pacing until she heard the doorbell. She gave me a brisk, warm hug and said, "You are braver than I expected," and then immediately added, "That is a compliment." I laughed. It was the right kind of laughter, the kind that releases something rather than the kind that covers something. Elena was in the kitchen. She came through when she heard my voice, and we looked at each other across the hallway, and I want to describe what was in that look because I think it matters. There was love in it, obviously. But there was also something else. A kind of mutual recognition. A sense that we were both fully present in the same moment, both aware of its weight, both choosing it. It was one of the most intimate exchanges I have ever experienced, and it happened without a single word. Margaret had prepared a room upstairs, her own room, which was the largest and the most naturally suited to the purpose. I was told, gently, to go up and wait, and that they would come to me shortly, and to take a few minutes and breathe. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled of rosewater and something floral that I could not name, and I looked at the things that had been arranged on the dressing table, the row of brushes and tools, the small bottles, the boxes of color, the particular organized complexity of a woman's preparation ritual spread out and waiting. And I felt, sitting there, the full presence of that moment I had experienced at 7 years old at my mother's dressing table. The same weight. The same sense of being present at something that mattered in ways I had not yet fully decoded. Except that I was no longer 7, and the compartment was no longer locked, and the questions were no longer filed away. They were all here, in this room, illuminated by late afternoon light, waiting to be engaged with honestly. They came in together. Margaret sat beside me on the bed. Elena sat on the small chair near the window. Caroline stood near the door, arms folded not in a closed way but in the comfortable posture of someone who is entirely at ease and fully present. And Margaret began to speak, and what she said was not what I had expected. I had expected instructions. Practical guidance. A gentle tutorial in the mechanics of the evening. Instead, she began with a question. She asked me if I had ever thought seriously about what it cost a person to be a bride. Not the financial cost, though that was real enough. The other cost. The cost of the expectation. The cost of the preparation. The cost of being, for an entire day, a symbol, a visible, public symbol of something larger than yourself, while also remaining a person, a specific individual person with your own fears and your own hopes and your own quiet interior life that no one in the gathered crowd would ever fully see. I said, honestly, that I had thought about it in the way that a person thinks about a thing from the outside. That I had had a general understanding of its difficulty without having had any real access to its particular weight. She nodded. She said that was the point. She said that the tradition, as she practiced it and as her own mother had practiced a version of it before her, was not about spectacle. It was not about humor. It was not about breaking norms for the sake of breaking them. It was about the specific, irreplaceable kind of understanding that only came from stepping, however briefly and however imperfectly, out of the position you had always occupied and into the position that was usually invisible to you. She said that the groom, on the morning of a wedding, woke up and showered and dressed and was ready in perhaps 40 minutes. She said. That the bride, on the morning of that same wedding, had usually been awake for hours already, had been in preparation for most of the morning, had been subjected to a physical process of transformation that was simultaneously beautifying and demanding, that required stillness and patience and endurance, that was accomplished by other hands working on her body, that produced a final result which would be scrutinized by every person in attendance and held against an enormous and largely unspoken standard. She said that none of this was complained about. She said that was precisely the problem, not that it was done, but that it was done without acknowledgement, without recognition of its real character, without the person for whom it was done having any genuine comprehension of what it actually required. Elena spoke then. She said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that she was not asking me to do this because she wanted me to understand difficulty in the abstract. She said she was asking me because she had observed, over the years we had been together, that I had an unusual capacity for empathy, a genuine desire to understand rather than simply to observe, and that this capacity was one of the things she loved most about me, and that she wanted us to begin our marriage from a place where that capacity had been exercised in the direction of her own experience. She said that the morning of a wedding was, for a woman, one of the most intensely interior experiences of her life occurring in the most externally public context of her life. She said that the contradiction of that, the profound inner experience happening under the complete and sustained attention of everyone who loved you, was something she wanted me to have some small, embodied understanding of. Not because it would make me a better husband in some theoretical sense, but because it would make me present in a way that intellectual understanding alone could not achieve. I want to pause in my telling of this and say something about what I was feeling at that point in the evening, because I think it is important and I think it is easy to skip over in favor of the more obviously narratable events that followed. What I was feeling, sitting on that bed in the amber light of a June evening, was something I had not felt in a very long time, perhaps had never felt in quite that form. I was feeling seen. Not performed at. Not received as a collection of observable traits. Seen, in the way that only happens when someone has invested the time and care to look at you with full attention and report back what they have found without editing out the complicated parts. Elena had seen the locked floor. Not the contents of it, I had never shown her those, not explicitly, but the existence of it, the shape of its door, the particular quality of silence it produced in me at certain moments. And she had not asked me to explain it or open it or apologize for it. She had built an occasion in which I could walk down those stairs myself, in my own time, with support, with safety, with the full knowledge that whatever I found there was not something I would be required to carry alone. That understanding moved through me in the way that significant things sometimes move, quietly, thoroughly, reorganizing things that had been fixed in one position for so long that you had forgotten they were not structural. And I sat with it for a moment, and then I said, "Let us begin." What followed over the next several hours was, on one level, a series of entirely practical activities. On another level, the level that I understood even while it was happening to be the real level, it was something altogether more consequential. Margaret and Caroline worked with patience and expertise, and Elena moved around the edges of the room with the calm, attentive presence of someone who was witnessing something they cared about. I sat at the dressing table, the same dressing table I had noticed when I first came into the room, and I submitted to the process of being prepared. I want to be precise about what this was and what it was not, because I think precision matters. This was not entertainment. This was not comedy. No one laughed. No one made the experience into a joke. The tone in that room was one of genuine seriousness, not heaviness, but the kind of serious attention that people bring to things they consider important. Margaret worked with the same quiet concentration I had watched my own mother use decades earlier, and there was something in the echo of that observation that moved through me like a second current under the first one. The physical experience of being prepared, of sitting still while someone else attends to your face with the full focus of a craftsperson, while someone else works with your hair with steady, deliberate hands, while you are asked to hold certain expressions and relax certain muscles and remain present in your body in a specific, attentive way, was something I had no adequate preparation for. I had imagined it in the abstract, and the abstract had given me none of its actual texture. The actual texture was this: it required a form of patience that was different from any patience I had previously practiced. It was not the patience of waiting. It was the patience of surrender. of yielding, temporarily and consensually, the management of your own surface, your face, your appearance, your visible self, to the careful hands of another person, and trusting that what they were doing served a purpose that you would only fully understand from the outside. When the process was complete and you looked in the mirror and saw what they had seen and worked toward the entire time. I noticed, during that process, how different it felt to experience my own face as something being worked on rather than something working. I was accustomed to my face as an instrument, as the thing I used to express, to communicate, to react. Sitting still while it was treated as a surface, as something with its own aesthetic reality that required deliberate curation, was disorienting in a way that was not unpleasant but that demanded a kind of conscious adjustment. I had to, several times, resist the impulse to apologize for something, for the shape of a feature, for some perceived inadequacy in the surface being worked on. I noticed this impulse and I noticed it with a kind of sudden, sharp recognition. Because I understood, in noticing it, that this was a reflex that many women knew intimately. The reflex of feeling that your physical self, when subjected to scrutiny and curation, revealed some insufficiency that required an apology or an explanation. I had carried versions of this reflex about other aspects of myself, intellectual, social, emotional, but never about my physical surface, because my physical surface had, by the standards of my gender and culture, never been subject to this particular kind of attention. And understanding it in my body, even briefly, even in this partial and borrowed form, was an understanding of an entirely different order from anything I could have achieved by reading about it or being told about it. At a certain point in the evening, Margaret set down the final brush, and Caroline adjusted a small detail near my collar, and Elena crossed the room and stood behind me, and I looked in the mirror. I am not going to describe what I looked like in any exhaustive detail, because that is not really the point. What I will say is that I looked, in some fundamental way, different. Not unrecognizable. Not like a different person. But like a version of myself that had been allowed access to a register it had not previously been permitted to use. And the feeling this produced was, and I am going to say this plainly, without apology, because it is the truth, it was not discomfort. It was not alienation. It was something much closer to recognition. A quiet, low-frequency recognition, like hearing a note that you had been waiting for without knowing you were waiting, and feeling it settle into a chord that had been unresolved until that moment. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Caroline, very quietly, said, "Well." And somehow that single syllable contained everything that needed to be said in that moment, and we all understood it, and Elena rested her hands on my shoulders from behind, and I met her eyes in the mirror. And something passed between us that I do not have precise language for but that I know changed the nature of our relationship permanently and for the better. We sat for a while after that. Not talking, specifically, or rather, talking in the way that people talk when they are actually in the presence of something that matters, when the conversation is not filling silence but exploring it. Margaret brought tea. Caroline sat on the floor with her back against the wardrobe, which was her habitual position when she was comfortable. Elena stayed near the window. And eventually Margaret asked me, not in a probing way but in the way of someone genuinely curious, what the experience had been like. Not the physical aspects. The interior aspects. What I had felt. I thought about how to answer. And then I did something I had not really done before in the presence of other people. I answered honestly, without editing. I said that what I had felt, more than anything, was the specific weight of being looked at. Not in a general sense, I was accustomed to being looked at, as anyone is. But the weight of being looked at with expectation. With a template already assembled in the observer's mind that you were being measured against. I said that this was something I had observed in women my whole life without fully understanding it, the way women managed, in almost every public context, a layer of self-monitoring that was not just about wanting to look good but about navigating a whole architecture of expectation and scrutiny that had been built entirely without their input. I said that sitting in that chair while being prepared had made that architecture visible to me in a way that nothing else had ever done. I said that I understood, in my body now rather than just in my mind, why that architecture was exhausting. Why carrying it quietly, day after day, without acknowledgement, without any recognition that the carrying was real and real work, produced the particular kind of fatigue that I had sometimes seen in Elena at the end of a long day and had not always known how to meet with the right response. Elena was very still at the window while I said this. When I finished, she said, "That is exactly it." Not in a way that suggested I had passed a test. In a way that suggested I had arrived at a place she had been waiting, with great patience, for us to arrive at together. We talked for a long time after that. About the tradition, and its history in her family, and the ways it had been received differently by different people who had gone through it. About the specific challenges of being a woman preparing for a wedding day, the months of planning, the physical preparation, the management of other people's expectations and emotions, the weight of being the symbolic center of an event that was supposed to represent mutual love, but that so often, structurally, fell most heavily on one person's shoulders. We talked about the ways in which social rituals uncode assumptions that nobody has explicitly chosen, and how those assumptions become invisible through repetition, and how the invisibility is itself a kind of weight, because invisible weight is the hardest kind to set down. You cannot ask for help with something that other people cannot see you carrying. I talked, too, more than I had expected to, more than I had done in any single evening in my adult life, about the locked floor. Not in those words. But I talked about the long years of quiet curiosity. About my mother's dressing table. About the way I had filed those questions away and kept them filed because I had no available framework for them, no permission structure, no language that felt both accurate and safe. I talked about the 20-year gap between the moment a feeling registered and the moment it could be spoken. And the three people in that room listened with the kind of attention that I recognized, as I spoke, as the specific quality of attention that Elena had always brought to me, but that I was now receiving from all of them. It was, genuinely, one of the most extraordinary experiences of my adult life. Margaret said something near the end of that conversation that I want to record here as carefully as I can, because I have returned to it many times. She said that in her experience of life, which by the time I met her was considerable, the people who most needed permission to be honest about complexity were usually the people who had spent the longest time believing that honesty about complexity would cost them something they could not afford. She said that the cost was usually imaginary. That what actually happened, when the honesty arrived, was not loss but expansion. That the space you had been managing carefully to prevent the complicated thing from being seen turned out, when you stopped managing it, to be a space where more of everything could exist, more relationship, more understanding, more peace. She said that she was glad I was the person Elena was marrying. She did not say this as flattery. She said it as observation. As something she was reporting from the evidence available to her. And it landed, as things said without flattery tend to land, with an entirely different kind of weight. We ate together that night. Roland had come home by then and joined us at the table, and Thomas was there too, home from university for the wedding weekend, and the dinner had the quality of family meals that are grounded in real occasion, not performed celebration, but genuine gathering around something that mattered. I was still, in external terms, in what I had been transformed into upstairs. No one at the table treated this as unusual, or drew attention to it, or required it to be explained. It was simply part of the evening. Part of the ongoing reality of a family that had agreed to take certain things seriously that other families might have dismissed, and to take seriously certain things about the people they loved that other families might have preferred to leave unexamined. I drove to my accommodation that night with the windows down and the warm June air moving through the car, and I did not think in the way I usually think, methodically, analytically, with the particular internal busyness of a person who finds silence slightly difficult to inhabit. I was very quiet inside. The kind of quiet that is not absence but presence, a quiet that feels like everything has been moved to exactly the right position and is resting there, still and right, for the first time. I sat with that quiet. I did not try to analyze it. I let it be what it was. I want to say something now about what happened on the wedding day itself, because I think it would be a significant omission to skip it. I arrived at the church. We had a small church wedding, Elena's choice, and one I found I was genuinely glad about for reasons I could not entirely articulate in advance, and I stood at the front with my brother Daniel beside me, and I waited. I had attended several weddings before my own and had experienced the waiting with the ordinary mixture of mild impatience and ceremony-adjacent emotion that most grooms seem to describe. This time was different. This time, when the music began and I turned and saw Elena at the back of the church, I understood in a way I had never understood before exactly what I was looking at. I was looking at someone who had been in preparation for hours. Who had sat still while careful hands attended to her surface? Who was carrying, along with the dress and the flowers and the weight of every loving eye in the room, the entire interior architecture of the day, the months of planning, the management of expectation, the particular vulnerability of being the most visible person in a room full of people who loved her and from whom she could not, in that moment, retreat into privacy. I understood what was in that walk down the aisle. Not the romance of it, though the romance was real and present, and I am not diminishing it. I mean the deeper thing underneath the romance. The courage of it. When she reached me, I took her hand, and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and I said, quietly, in the moment just before the ceremony began, I understand. She nodded. She squeezed my hand once. And then we faced forward together. The wedding vows are traditional in their language, as we chose them, and I had read them many times in the months of preparation and had found them moving in the way that ancient, worn words can be moving, familiar, resonant, carrying the weight of all the times they had been said before. But saying them that morning, holding Elena's hand, facing her full attention, I heard them differently. I heard the word cherish not as a pleasant sentiment but as an active commitment, a daily, practiced, attentive act that required knowing the person you were making it to with real depth. I heard the word honor as something that required knowledge, because you cannot honor what you do not understand, and I had spent the previous evening enlarging my understanding in a direction that would make the honoring more real, more informed, more consistently practiced. I heard the word love not as a feeling to be reported but as a discipline to be undertaken. And I meant all of it, the whole weight of all of it, in a way that I do not think I would have meant it with the same fullness if I had not first gone through what the previous evening had opened in me. It has been almost 4 years since that wedding day. 4 years in which I have had the opportunity to see whether what the Eve tradition produced in me was a genuine and lasting reorganization or a temporary emotional intensity that would fade when the occasion faded. I can report that it was the former. The things that evening rearranged in me stayed rearranged. The understanding it gave me of Elena's experience, and of the wider experience of the pressures and expectations that social gender places on women, has informed our marriage in ways that I notice regularly and that Elena has told me, in various ways at various times, she notices too. I am more present to her preparation. More aware of the invisible effort. More attentive to the specific kind of tiredness that comes from carrying something that other people cannot see. Not because I now have some complete or perfect understanding, I do not, and I would not insult the real depth of her experience by claiming otherwise, but because I have a foothold. I have a real, embodied point of reference from which I can reach toward her experience rather than simply watching it from a distance. But there is another dimension to what the Eve tradition did for me that is separate from its effect on my marriage, and I want to speak about it honestly because I think it is important. It did something for the locked floor. It did not resolve everything. I want to be precise about this, because I think the idea that one experience can definitively resolve something that has been built over decades is both romanticized and dishonest. There is no single evening that ties every question into a neat resolution. Life does not provide those, and I would be doing a disservice to anyone who has carried similar questions if I suggested otherwise. But what that evening did was change the relationship between me and those questions. It moved them from the locked room into the inhabited house. It gave them air and light. It gave them the company of other people, people who had witnessed them without flinching, without judgment, without reconfiguring their understanding of me in any direction that felt like loss. Margaret and Caroline and Elena had received what I showed them that evening with the same warmth and attentiveness that they brought to every significant conversation at their table. There had been no moment of reckoning. No moment where the thing I had kept private turned out to be something that required an apology or an explanation or a defense. It was simply a part of me, one part among many, welcomed into the room. That is what I had been afraid of for 24 years. Not that the questions would be judged harshly. Not even that they would be met with ridicule or rejection, though those fears were present. The deepest fear, I understood eventually, was that they would require explanation that I could not give. That when the floor was finally opened and someone looked down into it, I would be standing there unable to account for what they were seeing. Unable to provide the kind of clear, legible narrative that people expect when you reveal something long hidden. Unable to say, this is what it means, this is what it makes me, this is the category it belongs to. Because the truth was that I did not have that narrative. I had questions without answers. Curiosity without resolution. A genuine interest in an aspect of human experience that I had been assigned, by the accident of my birth, to stand outside of, and a long-term quiet sorrow about the distance that assignment created. That was the whole of it. Not neat. Not categorically legible. Just honest. And what I learned from the experience of finally saying something close to this out loud, in a room where it was received with warmth, is that the absence of a neat narrative is not a problem. It is not a deficiency. It is not something that requires resolution before it can be shared. Complicated, partial, unanswered things are the honest substance of most people's inner lives. The people who claim otherwise are usually either deceiving themselves or protecting themselves, and both of those strategies come at a significant cost. The cost is the locked floor. The cost is 24 years of questions living in isolation, visiting them alone in the dark, unable to benefit from the light and air that other perspectives could have brought to them. The cost, in other words, is exactly what Elena and her family had understood the cost to be, which was why they had built a tradition designed specifically to address it. I think about this often in the context of the conversations we are, collectively, having in this particular moment in history about gender, identity, expectation, and what it means to be human in the ways that transcend the categories we were handed at birth. These conversations are sometimes conducted with more heat than light. They are sometimes conducted with more certainty than the genuine complexity of the subject warrants. They are sometimes reduced to political argument, to cultural conflict, to competing claims about whose experience is real and whose is projection. I do not have a political agenda in telling this story. I have a personal one, which is this: the human interior is not binary. The human experience of self is not divided cleanly into two columns. It is continuous, and layered, and full of gradations and partial recognitions and questions that do not fit the available frameworks. And what we do with those questions, whether we file them away and keep them filed, or whether we find the courage and the context to bring them into the inhabited space of our lives, has enormous consequences for the quality of the lives we actually live and the depth of the relationships we actually have. The Eve tradition worked for me not because it provided answers. It worked because it replaced isolation with company. It worked because it replaced performance with presence. It worked because it took something that I had been managing privately for decades and placed it, gently and intentionally, in the hands of people who cared about me, and who handled it with the kind of care that I had, if I am being honest with myself, always hoped for but never quite allowed myself to believe was available. And finding out that it was available, that the care had been there all along, waiting for me to decide I was ready to receive it, was perhaps the most important thing I learned that entire evening. In the years since, Elena and I have talked about the tradition many times. We have talked about what it meant to her, about what she had hoped it would mean for me, and how it compared with what actually happened. We have talked about how it fits into the broader set of values and practices that we want to bring to our marriage and, eventually, to the family we are building. One of the things Elena said, in one of those conversations, was that she had been afraid I would experience it as a requirement, as something imposed, as a demand framed as a gift. She said she had tried very carefully to make it genuinely optional, genuinely chosen, but that she had been aware of the limitations of any choice that is offered in the context of a relationship where you want to please the person you love. She said that the fact that I had spent 3 weeks thinking about it before answering had reassured her somewhat, that it felt less like compliance and more like deliberation. I told her that she had read it correctly. That the deliberation had been real, and that the choice had been real, and that the result of the choice had been something I was grateful for in a way that only grew with time. I think it is important to say something about the nature of that gratitude, because gratitude for an experience that initially required courage can sometimes be retrospective in a way that flattens the actual complexity of having been brave. The truth is that there were moments during that evening when I felt genuinely vulnerable. Moments when the exposure was real and uncomfortable, and when I had to consciously choose, again, in the middle of it, to remain in it. Not just sit through it, but remain in it, remain present to it, remain open to what it was doing in me rather than retreating into the comfortable distance of observation. Those moments were uncomfortable. I am not rewriting them as easy. I am saying that the discomfort was worthwhile, and that saying it was worthwhile is something I am able to say with authority because I am 4 years on the other side of it and I can see what it produced. But worthwhile and easy are not the same thing, and I think it is important to be honest about that, because one of the things that makes people unwilling to take the kinds of risks that genuine growth requires is the expectation that it should feel good throughout. It often does not feel good throughout. It often feels uncertain and exposed and frightening. The goodness is on the other side, and you cannot see it clearly until you are through. Margaret passed away 18 months ago, after a brief illness, and her death was the kind of loss that reorganizes the grief you thought you understood into something larger and more complicated. I have thought about her a great deal since then. I have thought about the particular quality she had of taking people seriously, not in the formal, effortful way of someone working hard to be respectful, but in the natural, instinctive way of someone who simply could not see another person without immediately understanding that they contained multitudes. She was the person who had created the tradition that she offered to me on that June evening, and she had created it out of her understanding that love without knowledge was incomplete, that care without comprehension was a form of good intention that still fell short of what people actually needed from each other. The tradition was, in some important way, a gift she had given her daughter's marriage before it had even begun. The gift of a foundation that was built on something more durable than romance and ceremony, built on the harder work of genuine understanding, the kind that required showing up for the other person's experience rather than simply standing beside it. I carry all of this into our daily life and into the life we are gradually building together. The questions that lived on the locked floor are no longer down there in the dark. They are part of the ongoing, living, sometimes messy and always genuine conversation of who I am and who I am still becoming. Elena knows them. Her family, what remains of it, knows them in the form I shared them. I know them in a way I did not before, not as burdens to be managed but as elements of my full self, as information about the particular person I am, as part of the ongoing story of a life being lived honestly rather than tidily. And that, I think, is what growth actually looks like when you see it close up. It does not look like resolution. It does not look like the completion of a journey toward a fixed destination. It looks like expansion. Like the gradual, unglamorous, enormously valuable work of becoming larger on the inside, more capable of holding complexity, more capable of extending that capacity to the people you love, more capable of receiving the same in return. There is one more thing I want to say before I close this telling. I want to say it to anyone who is carrying a locked floor of their own. To anyone who is managing questions that feel too complicated or too fragile or too outside the available frameworks to bring into the inhabited space of their life. I want to say that the management is exhausting. I know how familiar the exhaustion becomes, so familiar that it stops feeling like exhaustion and starts feeling like the ordinary baseline. I want to say that the ordinary baseline is not the only option. I want to say that the questions do not require resolution before they can be shared. I want to say that the right people, and you will find them, and some of them are probably already closer to you than you realize, will receive what you carry with the kind of care that changes not what you are carrying but the experience of carrying it. I want to say that the locked floor is not the whole house. That the house is larger than you currently know. And that the key, which you have been holding all along, is never as dangerous to use as the habit of not using it has led you to believe. I did not expect that the night before my wedding would be the night that the house got larger. I did not expect it because I had not, until Elena offered it to me, understood that this was something another person could participate in. I had understood it as private, as mine alone, as the kind of thing you did alone in the dark or not at all. What Elena and her family showed me is that it does not have to be alone. That the most important kind of understanding is the kind that happens in company. That vulnerability offered to the right people in the right context is not weakness but its opposite. It is the bravest and most generative thing a person can do with the parts of themselves that they have been keeping in reserve. I am grateful for that evening. I am grateful for Elena's patience and her perception and her courage in offering something that she could not know I would accept. I am grateful for Margaret's warmth and her practical wisdom and the tradition she built out of her own understanding of what marriages actually needed to survive and grow. I am grateful for Caroline's brisk, unsentimentally loving presence and for the way she made the whole evening feel ordinary in the best possible sense, ordinary, meaning human, meaning real, meaning belonging to the actual texture of life rather than to the ceremonial surface of it. I am grateful for the evening itself, for its specific quality of gentle, serious attention, for the amber light and the rosewater and the tea and the long, honest conversation over dinner, and for the drive home through the warm June dark with the windows open and the world rearranged, slightly and permanently, into something larger and truer than it had been before. And I am grateful, most of all, for the fact that on the morning of the following day, when Elena walked toward me down that aisle, I knew what I was looking at. I knew what she had carried to get there. I knew the courage in her walk and the effort behind her face and the complex, layered, deeply interior experience happening quietly inside the beautiful, public ritual of the moment. I knew her, more fully, and in more directions, than I had known her the day before. And knowing her more fully, I loved her more fully. Which is, I think, the only formula for love that actually holds up over time. Not the love that asks the other person to be legible and simple and manageable. But the love that goes looking for the whole of them, the complicated, the private, the still unresolved, and says, I want to understand this. I want to be here for this. I want to build something with the whole of you, not just the parts that are easy to hold. That is the story. It is not a tidy story, and I have tried not to make it tidier than it is, because tidiness in a story about the interior life is a form of dishonesty that I am no longer interested in practicing. It is a true story, true in the ways that matter, true in its emotional reality, true in its conflicts and its fears and its gradual, unglamorous resolution, true in what it eventually became. And it continues to be true, daily, in the ongoing life of the marriage it helped to build. Thank you for watching and for spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or someone you love a little better, if it offered any language for something you have been carrying without quite knowing what to call it, then it has done exactly what I hoped it would do. There is more to explore, more stories like this one waiting to be told honestly and received honestly, and I hope you will stay for them. Because none of this work gets done in a single evening. It gets done the same way all real things get done, in pieces, over time, with patience, in company, and with the slowly growing conviction that the whole of who you are is worth the trouble of knowing.